All right, Pete, you're all set.
All right, thank you, Cassie. So good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Depending on where you're joining us from, I guess it's morning or afternoon. My name is Pete Markovic. I am a Senior Solutions Consultant with IMAGINiT Technologies. I'm being joined today by Tim Strandberg, who is also a Senior Solutions Consultant. And together, we're going to discuss the topic of connecting Fusion Lifecycle to ERP. Now, this is really meant to be a generic discussion in terms of ERP, but for our presentation today, we are going to be using NetSuite, but you know, it doesn't have to always, or doesn't necessarily need to be NetSuite. Your ERP would basically go through the same process for integration to Fusion Lifecycle. So at the end of this, we will have some time for questions and answers. So if you have some specific questions around a specific ERP system that we may have some experience with, we'll be more than happy to answer that. So just a couple things about IMAGINiT Technologies before we get going. We are a division of RAND Worldwide, which is made up of 4 divisions now. We have the IMAGINiT Technologies division, which is us. We're a platinum partner with Autodesk, providing consulting services, CAD software sales, PDM, PLM, implementation services, etc. And we also have a division RAND 3D, which works with the Dassault software and training with the Dassault software. You guys may have seen some training manuals by a company Ascent, that is also a division of RAND Worldwide. And we now actually have a new division called RAND Simulation, which is a division that specializes in different simulation softwares, not just the Autodesk softwares, but other softwares as well. So if you've got any simulation needs, you can reach out to us for those as well. We are now approximately 50 office locations, and we have north of now 200 technical resources throughout U.S. and Canada. So we are very diverse and spread across all the different disciplines. One of the things that we do for Fusion Lifecycle is we are a specialized certified partner with Autodesk. And what that means is Tim and myself have gone through some specialized training with Autodesk to implement and also to integrate Fusion Lifecycle to different various business systems, ERP being one of them. With these types of services, we can work with any size company, any level of complexity. So if you have any PLM or PLM integration needs, please reach out to one of your IMAGINiT salesperson, or go to imaginit.com and find the local closest sales or office to you. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with today's topic. It's a rather short agenda. We are going to have a demonstration in here as well. So we always like to show what we're discussing, and we're going to do it live, so that's always a little bit of a risk, but we're pretty confident things will go okay today, although it is a Friday and you never know. But we're going to talk about connecting Fusion Lifecycle to ERP. The first topic we're going to talk about is planning this out. And again, like I said, a lot of this is just generic. It can be used for, you know, connecting PLM to any ERP system for that matter. But it's just some really good basic practices when you're looking at doing an integration project. And again, in our case, we're discussing Fusion Lifecycle to NetSuite or to any ERP. So we'll start out with planning. Next thing we'll talk about is preparing your workspaces. So again, because we're in the context of Fusion Lifecycle, if you guys hopefully, you know, have some understanding of what Fusion Lifecycle is, if you're on the call and maybe you're new to Fusion Lifecycle, we'll give you a little bit of a background on that. But if you're already a Fusion Lifecycle customer, you'll understand what we mean when we're discussing the workspaces. We'll talk about mapping the data, and then go into what it looks like building the integration out. Then in there, we'll do a demonstration. Tim will demonstrate an integration that we have internally between our Fusion Lifecycle and, again, our NetSuite tenant. And then we'll follow that up with some other additional opportunities between PLM and ERP, so that if you do go down this path with integrating the two systems, what other opportunities are there beyond what we're going to be discussing today? And then we'll have some time again at the end for some questions and answers. So just a real brief background about PLM and ERP if you're somewhat new to this or not familiar with what the systems are. So PLM is the acronym for Product Lifecycle Management. It's all about managing the data, the processes around your product's entire life cycle. So starting through product design, through concept to grave, or cradle to grave, as a lot of people will call it. Its central focus is items and bills of materials. Pretty much everything plays off of that. You start with a part number, and then we connect things to that part number, whether it be ECOs, whether it be quality processes, supply chain, who's supplying those parts, warranty service. But all of those types of processes can be managed within a PLM system. So starting again at the top, product design, all the way through, maybe we have training requirements on those products, or even internally. Really, for Autodesk's offering a PLM Fusion Lifecycle, pretty much any business process can be modeled within the PLM environment. Now, if you look at ERP, again, Enterprise Resource Planning is what the acronym ERP stands for. Its primary focus, or at its core, is going to be mainly your financial and accounting. That is what most people are bringing in ERP for. But there's a lot that goes along with it. Like PLM, it's very broad, and we can start doing purchasing in there. Again, that ties back to finance, supply chain. Notice items and BOMs are in there. So we have to have some of this information in multiple systems. Inventory management might be in both systems, and so forth. So when we start looking at these two systems side by side, this is just a real brief example of some of the areas where we have overlap. And it's important to understand when we get into the planning phases of where we want this data to reside, and where it originates, who owns it, who can change it, and when those things change. So for today, we're just going to focus in on the items and BOMs. We could spend probably an entire day talking about PLM and ERP and how they can integrate and all the different benefits that you can gain in your business by doing so. But really, this is the first place to start for most companies. It makes the most sense in your first integration. And a lot of times, even for a company, this might be the first integration of any two systems you have in your company, if you have an ERP and PLM system. So that's why we wanted to focus in on this topic, because it's a really good place to start. So if we think about it in the context of Fusion Lifecycle, now we're working with pretty much the out-of-the-box, or what we call out-of-the-cloud, Fusion Lifecycle Tenant. So what you'll see, and what Tim is going to show you in the demonstration, is really just the item master, the way it comes down when you purchase the product, as well as the change management workflow that's in there as well. So we haven't really done too much. We've connected a few things here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty much out of the box. But when we look at the items and BOMs workspace, what does it consist of, right? So we have item records, item masters, and those will consist of, a bunch of metadata, right? Part numbers, descriptions, unit of measures. Those are three, very, almost in every system, I should say, very commonly used. There may be other things that you're tracking in there, manufacturing information or supplier information, product lines, whatever. In Fusion Lifecycle, we can build that item master out to be whatever you want it to be. Also in that items and BOMs workspace is the bills of materials. So we have, this parent-child relationship, and everybody probably on the call is familiar with this. It's pretty common in manufacturing to have bills of materials, and we have those same bills of materials in ERP. And so what we're going to do is we're going to work with transferring that information. So as you can see, this is very simple. A parent with two children, but the parent has metadata, the children has metadata, and you might have a subassembly buried in there with more children with metadata. So if you think of it in the context of the bill of material, there's quite a bit of data that needs to be transferred over to ERP. And if we had to do that manually, depending on the size of your bills of materials and things like that, it can be very much a lot of work. And so we have a lot of customers that reach out to us, and they're doing it today in two systems, and they're like, we need to, be more efficient with our time and our people, and not reproduce this over and over and over again. Now, on the change management side, again, these two workspaces work together in Fusion Lifecycle. So we have this item record, or bill of material, bills of materials. The change management is the record then that manages and provides workflow for the item or the bill of material in releasing it. Okay, so we have to have a change order inside of Fusion Lifecycle to actually release things. And so we're going to use that mechanism with its workflow to then move stuff to ERP. So I just did a quick screen snippet there of, you know, when we get this ECO approved, then after that, there's some things that need to happen. We're going to push this to ERP. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. But these are the two workspaces that really are going to be affected or impacted when doing an ERP integration initially. So the first step, and this is the one that, you know, I can't stress enough to not overlook or not do or not spend the right, you know, enough time in doing, is planning the integration with any project, with any integration, with any software development initiative. You know, planning is key, and that's where you're really going to dig into the details and get under the covers and figure out, you know, what you maybe didn't know. And you're not maybe going to get everything. You know, you never do, and that's fine too. This is an iterative process, but the more planning you do, probably the less rework you'll have to do once you get things in place and you start testing them. So, you know, the first step here is to identify the data. What is it that we want to transfer? Okay, so we're really talking about metadata for the most part, right? The describing fields and properties and things like that, part number, descriptions, unit of measures, like I mentioned. What things need to reside in both systems? And that kind of plays into the next thing, establishing the ownership. You may have the same fields in both systems, and maybe some of them Fusion Lifecycle owns, and maybe some of them ERP owns. That's perfectly fine. But you should map that out and really understand that, you know, before you get into building out the integration as to who's going to own it. And, you know, is it bidirectional? Is it something we want to edit in both systems? Do we want it to only edit in one system and always push it in one direction? So you want to start, you know, documenting those things down. Understanding the requirements. You know, what are required fields? This is one of our challenges anytime we go into integration with an ERP system, is to learn a little bit about the ERP system. You know, we're PLM experts, we're CAD experts, we're PDM experts. We're becoming ERP experts the more we work with different ERP systems. But, you know, what we're always finding out is every ERP system is a little bit different in terms of, you know, what are the requirements? Well, in order to construct an item in ERP, I have to do these things. Well, get that checklist, right? Somebody's doing it manually today. What are they doing, and what are those requirements? Well, I cannot create an item unless I fill out this field, and this field. Okay. Well, if we're going to have Fusion Lifecycle create that item for you systematically, we need to know that, right? Because we're going to have to pass over, at a minimum, that information. So really important to understand what those requirements are on both sides, and depending on which way you're pushing the data. And again, you know, looking at the system requirements and the limitations. As an example, with NetSuite, we cannot create an item type over there called an assembly item type that doesn't have any children. Okay? Doesn't mean we can put a placeholder in there and later on put children. Nope. Upon initial creation of that assembly item, we have to at least assign one child. And so understanding and knowing that is going to be very critical to having a successful integration. And then the system workflows. So, you know, some of these ERP systems, when you talk to ERP vendors, they'll tell you, well, we do PLM. And they certainly do. You know, SAP is a good example of that. They have a module called PLM, actually, for SAP, and there's some, you know, PLM functionality that's in there. So there again, not only is some of the data crossover, but there's sometimes even some of the processes are crossed over. But if there are some of those workflows that are shared in both systems, change management's a really good example. We do the change management side in Fusion Lifecycle. Well, some of the ERP systems, if not most of them now, have a change management module. Are you going to use that? Do you need to use that is really the bigger question in terms of, okay, I'm going to update a part from Rev A to Rev B. I do that in Fusion Lifecycle. Hey, can I just go and move the revision to Part B in ERP? Or do I actually have to use the change mechanism within the ERP? Those two integrations are going to look very different. So really you need to understand that and investigate that of what's available to you. And a lot of that's going to be documented through the APIs. That's one thing I didn't note in here, but you know, ERP's done a great job in the last probably 10, 15 years or so of documenting the APIs. You know, maybe 10 years ago there wasn't a lot of documentation. So you know, you're going to spend a fair amount of time looking that stuff up, but it's all worth it. You're going to need to know it. Some of the other things you need to plan out is your trigger points. when are we going to pass this information across from one system to the other, and how are we going to do that? Again, what is the trigger point going to be? Is it going to be a lifecycle or a workflow state change within Fusion Lifecycle? Like in our case, that's what we're going to be showing you today. We're going to change a state, and that's going to be our trigger point. Some integrations, we do things on a timer. Maybe every 30 minutes, we're data dumping stuff out of ERP and we're pushing it back to PLM or vice versa. So there's lots of different ways to trigger these things. And again, understanding what your business requirements and business needs are is paramount when you're planning this out, as well as conditions. Maybe certain conditions need to be met. So, well, our trigger is every 30 minutes, but we have also conditions for what data we want to refresh. So we're not just refreshing everything. Maybe we're just refreshing, obviously, updated records. That would make a lot of sense, right? We don't want to do a whole data dump every 30 minutes, but maybe there's something even beyond that. Maybe there's another condition that we need to know about in terms of defining this out. So again, the more investigation, the more time you spend on this, the better off you're going to be going into the integration and getting down the right path from the very beginning. Validation, that's just a part of any of integration, right? You know, we always want to say, okay, put this property over there, but we want to also validate that it did get over there successfully. So any good integration should have validation built into it. Whether that might be a write back, which we do quite often, where, you know, once we create the item inside of ERP, we'll maybe write back a URL into Fusion Lifecycle to that record in ERP. Or maybe we'll just set a flag over in Fusion Lifecycle that says ERP item created successfully. Okay, so we want to make sure we have some sort of validation in there, because, you know, when things don't work, and there's times it may not, you know, software update, system update, somebody goes in and changes something and breaks things, this will help you through the troubleshooting processes of figuring out where things are going wrong. Item parity, I put that in there, and again, that's kind of one of these things of like, how do we keep things in sync? Right? How do we keep one record tied to another record? And Fusion Lifecycle, again, if you're familiar with Fusion Lifecycle, if you're a current customer and you do any kind of scripting or that kind of stuff, that you understand what like the DMS ID is, it's a unique identifying metadata tag per record inside of Fusion Lifecycle, actually per revision within Fusion Lifecycle. And, you know, it's important that maybe that's the piece of information that we use and push that to ERP so that when we need to talk back and forth, we know we're talking to the right record. So again, figuring that out is also very important. And then lastly here is the error handling. You know, at the beginning, you're going to put in, you know, whatever you need to put in, basics, right, just to kind of troubleshoot the implementation. And then as it evolves, as you're working through testing and debugging, your error handling will evolve. Okay, it'll get more robust. You're going to find, oh, I didn't think of that workflow, or I didn't think of that use case. And that will. Now, again, the more you have documented up front and understand what these requirements are, the better, better place you can start with your error handling and hopefully catch, you know, the bulk of it there before you even start doing your first set of testing. But as we all know, if any of you guys are developers or programmers on the call, debugging, you know, putting in error handling and exception errors and things like that is always one of the last things we do. And that's just the nature of it, right? We want to get our products up and running and working. You know, that's the key thing. But never forget to put the error handling in. All right. So after we've planned everything, we're ready to start the process, really. And the first step here, what I would say, is preparing your workspaces. All right. So this again is going to be on the Fusion Lifecycle side. It could also be on the NetSuite side. I mean, there's times where we have to add fields over there as well. I mean, that's not uncommon, but it's more common to, you know, we're going to be putting spots in Fusion Lifecycle to talk to NetSuite or to ERP, because a lot of cases your ERP systems are, you know, they're well defined and in place and they're working and so forth. So, but on the Fusion Lifecycle, we'll go in and put in whatever required fields that we need. Now, when we're doing this, whether we're doing it in Fusion Lifecycle or doing it in ERP, make sure you're paying attention to the data types and sizes. We see this happen quite often where, hey, you know, we built out our items workspace in Fusion Lifecycle to have a 200 length character string for the description. Well, guess what? Our ERP system doesn't accept anything over 50. All right? Now, that happens, and it happens a lot. And maybe when we were doing Fusion Lifecycle's implementation, we weren't thinking about ERP integration at the time, but now we have to understand what can we do about that, right? Can we increase the length of the field in our ERP, or Fusion Lifecycle, deprecate it down, and what does that mean? And so these things will all start, falling into place, and you'll get a clear path pretty quickly what you need to do. But you need to make sure that you're checking this stuff so that the first time you run it, it doesn't try doing something like putting 200 characters into 50 characters and it's going to error out on you. One of the other things that's very useful and helpful is organizing your things in the Fusion Lifecycle your Fusion Lifecycle side by sections, okay? When you're building that item master out, you guys are aware of what we can do with sections and putting our fields in these different sections. So a little snippet there, ERP information over there, where, kind of organizing it. It helps for usability, it helps for adoption, and it just helps for troubleshooting and everything else that you have one area to look at while you're working on it to just kind of get organized. Required fields, again, if we know that we need to have something defined in order to create that item in NetSuite, or in ERP, I keep saying NetSuite, but any ERP for that matter, we can simply turn on a required field requirement inside a Fusion Lifecycle so that, again, we don't create those records in our Fusion Lifecycle tenant without filling that information out. And then lastly, we'll probably have some scripts. We have the on edits and on create scripts whenever we create or edit an item. And we find ourselves doing a fair amount of scripting inside of Fusion Lifecycle to handle different things for our ERP integration. It might be maybe we're using classification. That's actually kind of the next section here, but maybe we're using classification in Fusion Lifecycle, and based on some of that, if we pick this item type versus this item type, we need to have different information be in there for ERP. So again, scripts usually are going to get involved on the Fusion Lifecycle side in your integration. The other area that, again, we'll find in almost every integration we do is we have an admin section. Actually, even without integrations, Fusion Lifecycle, we tend to have an admin section where we might write some data in there that is not visible to the users. It's only for administrators, and some of this might be some of those write-backs that we're getting back from ERP. And again, classification is a good example of that because we need to get to that data. So these are just a couple ways of preparing your workspaces within Fusion Lifecycle to get you ready. One of the other things that we need to do in this case is the change management workspace, right? Items and BOMs change management for this integration. And in this case, it's really going to be around the workflow, right? Because that's our trigger point in this example. So if you're using the out-of-the-box change management process that came with Fusion Lifecycle, you'll see that there's already, well, I guess it depends on when you got your tenant, because there's been different versions of the tenant, but the most recent modern tenant that you can get from Autodesk right now has some ERP states already in there. If you don't, they're very easy to add, and you guys should know how to probably do that. A couple things about this is, this is a very common method for any kind of integration, is to have a state where maybe you had an issue. Okay, so in this case, we're going to push things to ERP. Hey, what if we don't get those write-backs? Or well, I shouldn't say that. Or what if there's a problem updating ERP? Well, we want to come back into Fusion Lifecycle and let somebody know, right? And so in this case, an easy way to do that is by pushing it into another workflow state, which, as you see there with the little envelope on it, means it's got some notification, so it's going to notify somebody. It's also going to notify somebody based on the transition, but it's also going to nag them. So, if they don't respond within a day, it's going to let them know again and again and again. And they're able to go in then and troubleshoot what happened in our integration, what went wrong, and fix it, and then go ahead and submit back to the ERP. Now, if everything's good, then we just simply go to the release state and close it out. Now, these integrations are generally going to come back in and actually automate your workflow portion of this. So the user will push it to ERP, to the pushing to ERP state, but then after that, if everything's good, your integration will come in and actually close out the change order. So you don't have to have people interacting with that. Now again, inside of these workflows, we are going to be dealing with validation scripts usually because, again, I can't stress enough, we need to make sure that what the requirements are on the other end, where we're going, that our data is right. And this is a great opportunity to do that. We have all these workflow states within our change order process that we can look for data, either on the change orders or on the affected items themselves. So you do spend a fair amount of time working on validation scripts in here, as well as some conditions and your trigger point. Now again, error handling, I kind of mentioned that before. So in this case, we push to a different state when there's a problem. That lets somebody know, and they can go in and they can deal with that. All right, so once we got to that point, one of the things that we would want to do is what's called mapping out the integration. And, you can do this on paper, you can do it in Visio, you can do it in Excel. I mean, there's a billion tools to do it, but I really just suggest that you do it. Get a list of the metadata. What's in Fusion Lifecycle, what's in ERP, what's the data that I have in one system, what's the data I have in the other system. As you can see here, the names don't always match, right? We have part number, we have item number in ERP. Okay, so having a map and having this available helps when you start building the integration. Okay, sometimes we have to transform data, and we need to know that, well, this field is feeding this field, and also maybe the direction, right? So down there at the bottom we have inventory location coming back from ERP at some point. Maybe not in this integration, but we want that fed back. So again, having a map is paramount in having good documentation of what you want to do. And then over there on the right, you can see now in our integration, we're using our product. At IMAGINiT, we have built a middleware platform called Pulse. If you guys aren't familiar with it, you can get some information on it from our website. But it is a middleware that runs in the cloud, and it's what we use as an integration engine between PLM and different ERP packages, as well as PLM and even Vault or whatever different systems that PLM might be integrating to. And you can see in there, this is pretty simple scripting language. It's a C# scripting language, but you can see in there we take one property, in there you're taking the title and you're mapping it to description. So that's how this is going to relate over. So the whole purpose of building out this map is to help out with the development of your middleware. And again, every middleware package is a little bit different. Maybe you're using a Jitterbit, or you've used Jitterbit, and some of those it's drag and drop, and this field goes to that field, and so forth. So it's going to all be a little bit different. Now the next step here is to actually start building the integration. And so we've planned, we've documented, we've got all our ducks in a row. What's the first step? Well, I guess in this case we've even made some changes to our workflows. I jumped ahead a little bit, but that's okay. We want to get our environment set up, right? And really, if you have the opportunity to have sandboxes for both PLM and ERP, that's ideal, okay? Doing an integration to a live in-production system is not preferable. It's not impossible, but it goes with risk. And so, we certainly would recommend having a development environment. We all know we can get a development environment of PLM. If you're an enterprise customer, you've already got a sandbox. If you are not an enterprise PLM customer or Fusion Lifecycle customer, you can acquire a sandbox for additional fee. But we do highly recommend having that. Now on the ERP side, it varies vendor to vendor. Some vendors will provide sandboxes, some vendors will not. Some vendors provide them at extra charge and so forth, but definitely well worth it. We have to create our endpoints. Whatever we're going to use to connect the two systems, whether it's Pulse, whether it's another middleware platform, we have to establish those endpoints. Now, in our case, we have endpoints already for Fusion Lifecycle. We have endpoints for some of the different ERP systems. But if there's an ERP out there that we haven't done, we would have to build that out. It's basic communication, right? Getting logged in, being able to talk to the API, and things like that. Modifications of Fusion Lifecycle, again, this is where you maybe do those modifications. Maybe the other step was just planning them out. But anyways, you're going to have to do some modifications. The next part is actually building out the mappings, okay? And again, this is going to vary by platform, whether you're in there writing some script in some sort of scripting language, or you have a middleware that provides you a nice GUI interface, all right? But you're going to have to say where this is going and probably some triggers and things like that. Step 5 there is developing the transactions. This is the extraction layer, right? This is where, okay, we're going to take that data out of PLM and we're going to push that over to ERP. So there's going to be generally scripts that do that, and it's the triggerings of when those things happen and so forth. Then you're ready to test. You know, I mean, it sounds easy, right? It's really 6, 7 steps, right? A lot goes into it, obviously, before you get to this point, but we're ready to start our first test. And definitely start out easy. You don't need to try to boil the ocean right away. Maybe just try pushing some items across, okay? We didn't really get into the bills of materials. I mean, that's a whole other thing. And again, you know, we have a limited amount of time here today, but maybe to start out your integration, you know, don't try to transfer a 1,000-item bill of material the first time you test your integration. Chances are you may have some problems and it may fail, but, you know, push a simple record across, a simple item, maybe a few strings of metadata, and just make sure that you can communicate. Make sure that you can get that over there. Then maybe update the record. Okay, I changed the description in Fusion Lifecycle. Make sure it updates over there in ERP. And then you can start building your scripts or your integration out to encompass the rest of your requirements and goals. Again, you know, when we start getting into bills of materials, it can get quite complicated. Things to think about there, do the children need to exist first? Before you know, probably before you can build an assembly in ERP, the children need to be there. Some systems that might let you create them at the same time, or if you create an assembly and you say these are the parts that go underneath it, it creates them at that point. It's going to vary from system to system, but again, that gets back into understanding what those requirements are. And if you're doing it today manually, talk to those people that are doing it. And generally, what you do manually, you're just going to automate. So that's kind of the practice there. And then once you know have tested and refined it to a point of, you know, we're ready to put this into production, then you would cut over from your sandbox environment over to production. Along the way, document the things that you've done. You know, I've added these 5 fields into Fusion Lifecycle. I've added these 6 fields into my ERP system. And keep that document up to date, because when you go to cut over to production, depending again on what system you might have, some systems will allow you to push changes from a sandbox to production. Other systems will require you to recreate those changes. And of course, you know, you run a risk then recreating those changes in your production environment if you miss something. So documentation is paramount throughout this entire process. All right, so I think I've done enough talking. I'm going to hand this over to Tim, and he is going to run you through a brief demonstration of what a PLM ERP integration can look like. And again, it's one that we have available to us, being Fusion Lifecycle and NetSuite, and I'll let Tim take it from there.
Okay, so just in light of time, or our limited time frame here for this presentation today, we've kind of fast-tracked or accelerated a couple of processes. Well, I'll try to explain as we go along the way. Here we've got a change order in Fusion Lifecycle. I've already attached all the affected items. In this case, it happens to be a scuba regulator. So we can see here we've got, you know, valve bodies and the regulator assembly itself and all of its children. So we've got the assemblies as well as all of the affected children all within the same change order. I've also already pushed it through the change process, so we're up here at approved. Pete mentioned that we do have an endpoint for Vault, and I actually used Vault to push these items from the Vault models, collect their metadata, and push those over into Fusion Lifecycle. So you can see here kind of these descriptor tags at the bottom. You know, right now the Vault files, or I should say the Vault files were in a review state. Then as it goes to approved, the integration platform then talks back to Vault, sets them to a release state. If we were going through, you know, a subsequent change process, they start out in a release state. We approve that, go to the implementation. Pulse bumps all of those files back to a work in progress state. The engineers do their work, reset it to review, it goes through the approval process, and finally comes back to a release state. So it manages and keeps in sync the revision shown in Fusion Lifecycle, always matches up with the items in Vault. For the sake of this demo, I've got the vault stuff turned off in the background, so we're not going to see any of that. But I'm going to go ahead now and push this to the ERP. In our case, as Pete mentioned, it is NetSuite. If I would hop over here, here's our Pulse platform, or I should say the console for the Pulse platform. We've got, well, things typically don't happen real time as much as we'd like them to. It still takes time to process things. But we'll see here in a minute, we're not going to sit here and watch this tick by tick on the clock as it's processing through, but we'll come back to this and take another peek at it. I'm going to hop over here for right now over to NetSuite. Here's one that Pete and I pushed through this process this morning. So here we've got our assembly bill of materials. This is a different data set, by the way. But here are properties that came across from Fusion Lifecycle. So we're pulling in that part name. It actually gets mapped to item name in the NetSuite side. We're pulling apart or pulling across our description, units of measure, those types of things. If I look down here under the manufacturing tab, there we can see that item's bill of materials. If I take a look at one of these parts, let's open up one of these items. So here's that specific item. We can see here that we've got a vendor, Strandco, for this. We've again got all of the pertinent information. As Pete mentioned, we can map essentially from anywhere to anywhere, massaging or transforming that data along the way. Maybe it's a string data type in Fusion Lifecycle. It needs to be an integer or a double or a number or whatever on the ERP side. We can handle that all in the background with during our transformation and mapping process. If I would take a look here, Pete mentioned a couple of times about write back. Here we've got on our custom tab, here's a custom field that we created. It says the Fusion Lifecycle item, click here. So what happens if we click there? Lo and behold, it takes us right back to that item on the Fusion Lifecycle side. And we've got the reciprocal link right here that if for the Fusion Lifecycle users, if they need to go take a look at that ERP item, maybe to pull out some costing or check and make adjustments over on that system, here's the link back to that NetSuite item. If we would jump back to Pulse here, and I'm going to just hit a quick refresh. Let's take a look at the log and see what it's doing so far. So as Pete mentioned in his bullet list there, there's a number of steps that we have during the implementation. And actually, a number of things happened when I triggered this transition. Pete mentioned scripting. Well, there's actually a little JavaScript that runs behind the scenes in Fusion Lifecycle. When I trigger that transition, it goes off and runs that bit of code in the background. One of the things that it did was to make the call into our Pulse platform and hand it off this ECO ID number, which is right here. Pete mentioned that DMS ID. So we're handing Pulse that DMS ID number. So from that, it's retrieving that ECO, and then it's going through and checking for all the affected items. Here are all of those affected items that it found on the bill. And then it begins its mapping, and it successfully read 17 items, goes through and maps all of those items accordingly. We'll see how far it got down here. There's a lot of mapping, guys, believe me. And it looks like that's where it's at. If it's, oh, now it's done. We can look at, clear down here to the end. So now we're checking the assemblies, and it's updating the parts that it's going to send to NetSuite. So here we can see upsert NetSuite item. The add response was true, so it just created this subassembly on the NetSuite side. Here's our master assembly. As Pete mentioned, NetSuite has the restriction that it won't let you create an assembly bill of materials without children or without components, as NetSuite calls them. So we actually go through and analyze all of the content, find all of the children, build the children first, then go back and build the subassemblies, and then finally go back and build the top-level assembly. So then now we're pushing that data back to Fusion Lifecycle. We're updating those properties. We're writing back that information back to Fusion Lifecycle. So if we were to take a look now over here on the NetSuite side, we look for 300 numbers. Here we can see there's our items that we just created. Here's our top level item. And we can see then it's got sub-assemblies underneath. There's a plug assembly, there's a valve body, another plug assembly, a yoke assembly. And as we drill through these, we get the same exact content. So we get quantities and everything. It's just a translation essentially from, harvest what's in one system, transform the data so that it's in the proper format, and push it to the other system. That communication can be bidirectional as well. If we take a look at this main body part, we can see that its vendor name is Scuba Pete Inc. Well, if I would come over here to Fusion Lifecycle and just double check, do we have that vendor, do we have that supplier over here on our side? No, that only exists in NetSuite at the moment. Pete mentioned, we need to make sure, which system owns the data. In this case, NetSuite owns, while Fusion Lifecycle owns the items and BOMs, NetSuite owns the vendor relationship and the customer relationship. So it owns those records. But maybe we want a copy of that record over on the Fusion Lifecycle side. So if I were to go to vendors and create a new vendor and call that guy Scuba Pete Inc. Pete likes to scuba dive, if you guys didn't know. And we'll put in his phone number. Now the whole world has your phone number, Pete. What else might we want to add here? Oh, let's go ahead and put in his address. Attention, Pete. We already have the phone. Somewhere Circle in Hutchinson, Minnesota. Okay, so now we've got that information in there. We just created that new vendor. I'm going to go ahead and save this vendor just like we had the manual trigger over on the, did it save? Yep, I guess it did. There's already a vendor. Okay, fine. Just like we had that trigger point, that manual trigger during our ECO process, we had actually an event trigger set up here in NetSuite. So anytime that vendor record a new vendor record is created, the vendor record is updated, whatever the case may be, it's going to write that information over back to Fusion Lifecycle. So here we can see it's processing, it's creating a new NetSuite vendor, Scuba Pete. And now it says it's done. If I refresh the screen over here, now we've mapped the other direction. So we can see, yep, there's his supplier number. He's a contract manufacturer. Our contact is Pete. There's his address. And now we can manage that supplier over here. You know, it looks like by default he's on a 6-month audit schedule. So it just shows, just to demonstrate that, you know, we can have triggers on either side, and we can transform data, map data going either direction. And with that, back to you, Pete.
All right, Tim, thanks. I expect birthday and Christmas cards now that everybody has my address. All right, so can you see my screen again, Tim?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you for that. We've got just about 15 minutes here or so. This is going to wrap up here in a few minutes, and then we'll have some time for some questions and answers. So what are some of the other areas of opportunities? You know, once you do establish this PLM ERP integration, and again, items and BOMs is really the focal point or the first place that I would focus on and start. That's generally the first thing we want. But there's some other areas, suppliers. Tim just showed that, right? So ERP could be another system, for example, or when we start talking about customers, you know, a lot of customers have CRM systems today, maybe Salesforce or something along those lines. And we need that information in PLM as well in a lot of cases, right? We want to start tying our products and maybe support cases or issues or things like that that are tied to a particular customer or even to a supplier back into PLM, where they can be tied back to the item and start tracking NCRs and start tracking CAPAs and getting into our quality processes. Because our quality processes are very important, right? I mean, everybody's being measured on that today, but getting all that information in one place, that's where a PLM system really, really does a good job. But the information that we need may not all be in PLM, right? It might be in other systems, and that's fine. In a lot of cases, it's coming from another, you know, from ERP or, like I mentioned, CRM or all sorts of different softwares out there. So that's a couple examples. Inventory, that's a common thing that we pull back to. When we're doing a change order and in Fusion Lifecycle, and we put our affected items onto our change order, one of the things that's common is we can either do an on-demand script within PLM, or we can do a trigger of some sort, but will be to go get the current inventories of the parts that we're changing, right? How many parts do we have on hand? Do we have 10 or do we have 10 million? Because that might impact what we do for disposition, right? And so having that information inside of PLM during the process of writing the change order, well, that's a pretty good idea. Now, yes, we can stop what we're doing, get out of PLM, go log into ERP, look up those items and get them, maybe. You know, as an engineer, I don't know, maybe I worked for the wrong companies, but no one let me into ERP. Maybe that was just me. And so a lot of times, not everybody has access to that system that the data resides in. So giving access to that information, in this case, read-only, right? We're not changing inventories in PLM. We just want that information to come across so that we can make better informed decisions as an engineer on what do we do with the existing inventories and where are they at, maybe locations as well. Costing is another thing. You know, we get asked fairly often about, you know, well, should we put our costing into PLM? And I'm like, well, do you have it somewhere else today? Oh, yeah, we have it over in ERP. Okay, well, I like the idea of having costing in PLM, but I don't like the idea of maintaining it in two places, right? So without integration, I would say, no, I don't want to do that. As an engineer, I don't want to have to be updating those records constantly that, you know, we're paying 2 cents more this week than we were last week kind of thing. So that's getting back into the whole planning and mapping, right? Figuring out where does the information reside, who owns it, where should it go, when do we need it, and how's it going to get there, right? But that's just different areas that you can, you know, build on and once you get this initial integration in place, look for these other areas because you've already did most of the heavy lifting and the rest of it, you know, should be fairly simple or less complex after that. All right, so that's what we got for today. We're about 10 minutes before the hour, which is about right where I wanted to be. So we have enough time here for some questions and answers if we have some. Cassie, is there anything in the